Welcome to Inside Racing. John Schreck's life took several twists and turns before he settled into the role that was to make him a household name in the racing industry. Early in life he tried farming, but his dreams were shattered by drought. He made several unsuccessful attempts to break into race broadcasting before focusing his attention on a career as a stipendiary steward. From a part-time beginning in Tasmania, John graduated to the VRC panel where he became deputy chairman. In 1981, he was appointed chairman of stewards with the AJC in Sydney, a job he held for 14 and a half years. During that time, he was directly involved with some of the most sensational cases in Australian racing history. Recently, we caught up with the man they call the Sheriff, and he was in a reflective mood. Well, John, you spent your childhood at Warialda in northwestern New South Wales, and you and your two brothers were reared on the land. What are your recollections of the family farm?
Well, John, before we went to the farm, I grew up in Warialda and spent my sort of growing up years there, and then we went to the farm in the 50s as a result of my father going to the war, and then there was a block that came along after the war. I have happy memories of the farm. There were only a couple of things I really wanted to be, John, was a race broadcaster or a farmer, and neither of them worked out. So I didn't like driving tractors and all that sort of rot, but I liked working with sheep and horses and cattle, stock work. But of course, in that part of the world, to make a living, you had to get on the tractor.
Now, your schooling finished early by design.
Yeah, and stupidity, John. I left school when I was too young, because I was just crazy about getting out into the bush and that sort of thing. So I did my intermediate certificate, when I was younger than most people, and left the day after that and went down to Western New South Wales. We wore Gunnedah all around that area, walking cattle about with an old friend of ours. We had about 500 head of cattle on the road. So that was my first job after originally leaving school. And then I did go back to school after that, went back to Tamworth to do a wool classing course.
We should establish at this early stage how your love of racing developed. Now, your dad raced the odd galloper, and it seemed that there was always a horse in your backyard.
There was, John. I can remember going to the stables, Potty Cleal stables in Warialda when I think even before I started school, I used to go with my father. He had a horse or two with Potty Cleal, just after the war. Yeah. So there was always a horse around, and he was the secretary of a race club, and later on president of the race club, and later on a bookmaker. So as far back as I can remember, I've been going to the races, John, going to the race tracks and the stables and that sort of thing. And in those days in Warialda, I don't know how many horses were in the town, but there must have been 20 or 30. Yeah. But of course, there's no horses trained in Warialda now. But in those days, all those country towns, Warialda, Bingra, Barraba, all those places, had a stack of racehorses there. It was the thing, John.
You said your dad was a bookmaker, and he worked on that northwestern circuit on the away races. He'd set up shop fielding on races in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. Now, you went with him to most of those meetings, and you had a job to do.
Yeah, that's right. Well, when he first started off, of course, he was betting on the locals, and then sort of graduated to the away races where everybody seemed to think there was more money. But he was a good bookmaker, but he let too many. He'd been around Warialda all his life, John, so he let too many on the Murray cod, on the nod, and didn't get squared up a lot of the time. But yeah, on a Friday night, he used to have to write up in those days, of course, it's very different from now. They had to write the sheets up for the boards, and he used to write, he had a very flowing, nice hand, and he used to write the sheets up, and I'd call the jocks to him. So that was the Friday night job, and then Saturday, away we'd go to the races.
You've already mentioned that you had an ardent desire in early life to become a race caller. Inspired, no doubt, by the famous voices that you heard on the radio networks in that era, the Ken Howards, the Bert Bryants, the Vince Currys, the Jeff Marnies. Who inspired you the most?
Well, I guess, John, like everybody else around in those days, Ken Howard, because it was, he was just, we used to think in the bush, just it was so colourful, and we all knew, even as kids, that he was off the track and all that sort of thing.
Dynamic.
And it was just wonderful to listen to him in the country. And of course, every Saturday morning listening to Cliff Carey and all that sort of stuff was all was just, I just used to just get me in, John, and I really thought that was where I ought to be, but fate didn't quite work out that way.
You had 2 or 3 racing idols at this time of your life. One of them was the late, great Jack Thompson.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it was, John. I had a bedroom at Warialda where we lived out the back of the house, kind of on the veranda, a sealed-in place. And around the wall I had, out of the old sports novels that used to be in those days, I used to cut the photographs out and the pictures out of those magazines and stick them around the wall. And Jack Thompson was prominent around my bedroom wall, so it was it was great later on in life. I know he'd passed his prime when I came to Sydney as a stipendiary steward, but it was still riding, and it was still wonderful for me to be across the table from Mr. Thompson. And I know he'd gone over the hill, but he was still. It was always, to me, it was always yes sir and no sir, and nothing else, and I just thought that was pretty good, John.
In the early 60s, you learned that Sydney radio station 2UE were calling for audition tapes in their quest to find an understudy for Des Hoisted, and you applied.
Yes, I did. I came down. I was actually on the farm at the time. The place we called it Mossgrove, and I was on Mossgrove at the time, in the early 60s, as you say. So I came down with some tapes that I'd had from races that I'd called around Queensland and northern New South Wales, and met with Des Hoisted at 2UE, and it must have been a Wednesday or Thursday or something, and he suggested that I go to Canterbury and do the meeting there, which I did, onto a tape, of course, and. Not very well, I'm sorry to say, because the fields were large and I hadn't seen the horses before and all that kind of thing, so I was just a bit out of my depth. And of course, as Des suggested, the way to go about it was to do something part-time and improve, which I couldn't do, John, because I had a wife and a couple of kids.
Yeah.
So that was at that time, that was the end of my dream of being a race broadcaster. I either wasn't good enough or wasn't in the right place at the right time, John, one of the two.
And the successful applicant for that particular job was?
That was Ian Craig, which took on from there. He bolted away and became what he was as a great race broadcaster.
Very keen in from King Liffard late, but very keen, too good for King Liffard.
You were 18 years old when you landed a job with the famous shearing contract company, Grascos, and that job took you to many parts of Australia.
Yeah, the Grascos was a shearing contracting company set up by the Graziers Association, and they were back in 1956, John, in the big shearers' strike, and particularly in Queensland, it went on for a year. And I went with them after the strike. I didn't go there during the year whilst the strike was on, but after the strike was over, I went working with them in Queensland, and they were really, really great to me and to my family. A good little company, and I worked with them in Longreach and St George and Gundawindi, and then further south later on.
Now, you met your wife-to-be, Jan, in Longreach.
Yes, Jan was a Longreach girl, and I was up there working for Grascos, and I suppose you never know how the ball's going to bounce, John. So we met in Longreach, and we were married in Longreach. We're only kids, and kind of a lot of people say, my father used to say, well, when we had kids very young in our married life, and he used to always say, well, you can grow up with your kids, which we kind of did, John,
Yeah.
It had some good points and bad. It was pretty difficult early on because I was smoking cigarettes and had a share in a couple of racehorses, all those stupid things, and trying to feed a couple of kids as well. So sometimes the kids would go hungry and the horse would get fed, John.
During your time in Tasmania, and we haven't mentioned that Grascos sent you to the Apple Isle, you spotted an advertisement one day placed in the press by the Tasmanian Racing Club, and you made inquiries.
Yes, I did, John. Well, obviously I wanted to do some race broadcasting in Tasmania, but a fellow called David McQuestion had it sewn up in the northern part of Tasmania, around Launceston and those areas, and he went on to be a fairly significant player in the media in Tasmania. And a fellow called Milton Pettit had it sewn up in the southern part of Tasmania, in around Hobart. So I could see myself not getting involved for all sorts of reasons. And this job as a stipe attracted me. And I thought, well, that's one way to stay around the horses, John. And it was in Hobart, not far from where we were living in Campbelltown. So I did apply, and I had a pair of race glasses and a rule book on the Friday, and Saturday I was a stipendiary steward.
Right, and this you were 28 years old,
About
so
that,
you were a
John.
late starter.
Yeah, that's right. You could say that these days, John, because the people that are starting off as stipendiary stewards start very young these days. But in those days, it probably wasn't that, so young. Most of the there was more maturity about the panels in those days than there is now. Quite why I don't know what the reason for that is, but that was the case. So you could say I was I was mature, John.
Now, John, you sat down one day and you wrote a letter to every major race club in Australia expressing your interest in becoming a full-time steward. The last club you expected to get a reply from was the VRC, but you did.
Yeah, but positive reply, John. I was very lucky. The kids were sort of growing up and working for Grascos. I could see myself always in country towns because that's where their offices were. So I had to look to move on, or they were going to have to be sent away to school. And so I did, as you said, wrote to all the major clubs around the countryside. I had a bit of a leg up, to be truthful with you, John, at the VRC, because I'd done a lot of work for the Kresick family, who owned big properties in the Riverina, and at the time Sir Alec was the chairman of the Victoria Racing Club, Sir Alec Kresick, and so I had a little bit of start, John.
Absolutely.
Some might say a
flying start.
yeah.
John, around 1970, you became an assistant steward with the VRC, working under the chairmanship of a man called Jim Ahern, who was destined to have a major influence on your life and your career. Yes,
well, Mr. Ahern was very good to me, John, really, really good to me. And he was getting toward the end of his working life when I first met him, but he was still a great stipendiary steward in that he could project his mind forward to changing trends and all that sort of thing in the conduct of racing inquiries, and the need for fairness and natural justice and all that sort of stuff. And he did have a big influence, and I'm not much good, John, at chitter-chatter, small talk sort of stuff. But the old boss, he could sit here today and talk to you if he was still alive, and talk to you about racehorses and Angus cattle and growing roses and racing pigeons and racing greyhounds and travelling the world, all those sorts of things. He just was able to and he could talk to you here, and he'd walk out the door and talk to whoever might be there, the Prime Minister or the Governor General or whatever, and then talk to a little kid mucking out a stable, He just had that sort of, which not many people have got, John, You and I can chat about things, but not many can go from the top to the bottom and be comfortable and make the person to whom they're speaking comfortable, and he had that gift.
Even though you were quickly onto the stewards panel full time, for some reason, 2 or 3 years later, you got itchy feet. You left thoroughbred racing for a while. You went to the Trotting Control Board as senior steward and deputy racing administrator, working with a man called Wally Waite.
Yeah, well, you'd remember Wally Waite, John. He was in a great trotting identity back in the Len Smith days and all those sorts of things. So yes, I did. It was in hindsight, it was.
Why did you do that?
Well,
did you want to be chief steward?
Well, it was a very good question, John, and the answer to it's probably pineapple. It was a silly thing to do at the time because I was keen to climb the ladder quicker than I was climbing, and I could see having more responsibility at the trotting control board, the old trotting control board, who were racing in those days at the showground, as you would recall, in Melbourne. And indeed I did, John. I was running, every time I'd go to the races, pretty well. I was in charge of the meeting. And so I had my run-ins with George Gath and all sorts of people in those days. Gavin Lang's father too. We had a little sparring round or two for £1 or £2 kind of thing. So even though it was a silly thing to do, John, it was, in some ways, it was a wonderful education, because I had more responsibility and I was making decisions, and some of those meetings in those days, some of those blokes are they test you out, John, and it was a good education for me.
In the middle of 1976, an opportunity arose for you to return to thoroughbred racing, to the VRC panel, this time as Deputy Chairman to Pat Lawler.
Yeah, not quite, John. When I first went back there, again, it was probably primarily because of Jim Ahern. He was still the chief when I went back.
Oh, yeah.
And then he stayed in that role for a couple of years. And then when he retired, Pat Lawler became chairman and I became deputy chairman to Pat. And so, touch wood, and everything worked out well for me, John. I was lucky, and continued to work hard, and people like Sir Rupert Steele, and who was the chairman later on of the VRC, were, the VRC committee were extraordinarily good to me, John, as was the AJC committee, of course, and other committees that I've worked for as well. But they were very, very good to me, really good.
In the 5 years you spent as Deputy Chairman to Pat Lawler, you saw an elite group of jockeys in Melbourne. One of them was Roy Higgins. In fact, you were there during his golden years.
Yes.
And you have emphatically declared on more than one occasion that Higgins is the best you've seen.
Yes, John, I've said that publicly many times, and gone into print saying that, and for a variety of reasons. He was a wonderful, wonderful jockey, of course, and when the first day that I walked onto the Flemington track of a morning, and I'd only been there, I'd come across from Tasmania, nobody knew who I was or anything else, and one of the first people in the old stripping sheds in the middle at Flemington in those days, where they used to scrape them down, Higgins sort of walked this way and I walked that way, and it was good morning, sir, and all that sort of thing. And that was the way he was till the day I left there. It was always very formal, and I just can't imagine anyone in being a much better jockey, John. I used to sometimes be sent to the 1,200 metres at Moonee Valley, and they'd come down the hill toward that first turn out of the mile start at Moonee Valley, and like there'd be Trevena and Mitchell and White and Aitken and Jarman and all these blokes. They'd have Higgins truly, truly hanging over the rail, and he'd just quietly hold his ground, and it was just really
pretty to watch.
Pretty to watch, John. Wonderful, like the courage of the man. The courage of all jockeys, but he was just really. And the other thing, John, that I'll say to you, I know there have been lots of great jockeys, Munro and Moore and all these sort of people. But Higgins, in all the years that he rode racehorses, John, he was never, not once was he questioned about a ride on a horse. I'm not going to say he didn't give one a little bye sometimes.
A kind run.
A kind run, John, that's a good way to put it. But if he did it, he did it very in a subtle way and didn't offend the sport or anybody around. So he was a great ambassador to the sport, really.
John, in 1981, the coveted position of Chairman of Stewards for the Australian Jockey Club became available when John Marnie decided to move to Western Australia. You got the Guernsey.
Yeah, got the gig, John, yes, as they say. They advertised the job, and over the years the AJC had been very loyal to their own people. They'd always appointed someone from New South Wales, never appointed anyone from away. But I applied, and Sir James Carr was the chairman at the time, and I had some interesting referees for the job. Of course, Pat Lawler and Bob Hawke was a great supporter of mine, as was Keith Robbins and a few others. So eventually they offered me the role, and I came to Sydney, John, which...
Destined to spend 14 and a half years in the job.
Yeah, it spent a long time at it, John, and had some ups and downs. And, as I mentioned to you before, the AJC committee were extraordinarily good to me. Like anybody supports you, John, when things are going along pretty good.
Yeah.
But when you hit a bit of a hurdle, that's when the support...
It's put to the test.
It's put to the test, John, and they stood firm a couple of times I needed it.
Well, you had an immediate impact on Sydney racing. In the pre-Schreck era, getting a protest upheld in Sydney was almost impossible. The odd one was fired in, but they rarely got off the ground. Now, you came bouncing into town and upheld 3 or 4 in the first month. You had very strong conviction that a horse is entitled to clear running.
Yes, I did, John, and I still do. And actually, we upheld one, and I think he's a mate of yours. Neil Campton got one day at Randwick just after the start, which caused a bit of a drama. But even today, with the young people that I work with,
Placid River.
Was that the name of the horse?
Was the name of the horse?
Was it? Yeah. I know the other jockey was John Duggan, who caused the trouble, and we gave it to Campton, and that was caused quite a.
That was a groundbreaker.
That was a groundbreaker, John. Yeah. But I would definitely do the same thing today. It just had to be sustained. But I have always had the philosophy with protest. It's a very subjective sort of thing. You've got to try and work it out. But John, I also take the view, whilst the horse first past the post, has got a bit of a start because he did get there first.
Yeah.
But if he's gotten there by impeding another runner, well then, you've got to give the other bloke a bit of a crack, haven't you? I think anyway, John. Yeah. And they're not entitled to get in other people's road. They're entitled to a clean run, and if it means upholding the protest, well, I've always had the view, don't worry about it. If you can sustain it, and if you've got good reasons for doing it, just simply go ahead and do it. Don't worry about it. The only person you've got to please, John, when making decisions like that is yourself.
You found yourself in several pressure cooker situations during your time as chief steward in Sydney. One of them was the famous Missile Stakes flag start.
Thank you, John, yeah.
It had been raining for 3 weeks. The track was an absolute quagmire, and the barrier stalls couldn't be towed into the position that they needed to be in for the start of the Missile Stakes. So you made a revolutionary decision to allow you turned back the clock a century.
Yes. Well, I think they're going to start jumps races or they were going to start jumping races in Victoria with flags, but anyway, I don't know what's happening down there with the flags now. But Brian Killian and he was the deputy with me at the time, and it was Missile, so first weight for age race of the season, so it's a pretty significant race. And what you said is right, the stalls were bogged, and the ones that they could get into position, I think there was a bank of 10, say, and we had 13 runners, something like that. And so there were a number of decisions had to be made fairly quickly, John, bang, bang, bang. One was to void the race altogether, just cancel it. 2 was to ballot 3 out so that we could use the 10 that were there, and that hardly fair to the 3 that you're taking out because they might have come miles to run, or started with a flag. And Bill Dale was the starter, and I don't think he's started one with the flag before or since.
No.
And, of course, as Murphy's Law would have it, John, the 200 to 1 shot won the rotten race.
And that was the problem. You needed the favourite badly.
We desperately wanted the favourite, John, yeah.
You were right in the middle of the storm when a horse called Chock Daly returned a positive swab to the dreaded elephant juice, Etorphine, and I think he was the first horse in the eastern states to return a positive to elephant juice.
Yes, he was, John. That's right. It was at Rose Hill, and that horse returned a positive to elephant juice, and that was obviously a big deal for us. And one of the interesting things came out of that case was that the the trainer wanted to have legal representation at the inquiry, and the rules prevented that, but we gave consideration to it and said that no, you can't have legal representation, your barrister will have to wait outside. And as a matter of fact, it was a chap called Bakos, who was Peter Bakos' brother, was the barrister for the trainer, and they didn't accept that. Mr. Bakos didn't accept that, so we were taken to the Supreme Court and challenged there. But fortunately, the courts found in our favour, and we were allowed to proceed without legal representation being there. Yeah. But it's interesting, John. One of the things when we were considering whether to allow legal representation or not, and how careful you have to be as a racing steward, I said to Mr. Bakos and all the other people in the room, all right, you've made your presentations, words to this effect, you've made your presentation, now if you'd wait outside for a second, we'll consider it. And that became a big thing in the court. Schreck was only going to consider this for a second, wait outside for a second. I should have obviously shown, and from that day forth, I always said, if you'd mind
wait
adjourning,
for half a day.
Well, wait, and we'll consider it. But it was a throwaway line that caused a bit of trouble, John. But it was a lesson well learned.
You must have feared the worst at the time. I'll bet you were laying awake at night hoping there'd be no more elephant juice positives in Sydney.
I was, John, because for all sorts of reasons, because it's so bad for the sport and so bad for the animal. Like, it's different if you and I want to take drugs, John, but the poor horse just stands in the corner of the box and gets hit with whatever they hit him with. I just don't think it's right. And particularly with something like elephant juice, like if they give them too much, they'll drop down dead, of course. But if they're given the right amount, well, of course, they'll run through a brick wall, as was proved with some tests that were done at the University of Sydney. It's just a
horrendous impact.
A horrendous impact, John.
Join us next time around for part 2 of the John Schreck story as he recalls the infamous jockey tape scandal which was leaked to the Sydney Morning Herald on the eve of the Golden Slipper.
I knew back in the spring of '94 that these tapes were about and kept asking certain people, is everything all right? And I was assured that it was. There was nothing. But once they got into the press, of course, that became... Then it wasn't all right. It was a blue. And we had to do what we had to do.
In part 1 of the John Schreck story, the former high-profile steward reflected on his days with the VRC and the influence of his first boss, Jim Ahern.
Mr. Ahern was very good to me, John, really, really good to me. He was getting toward the end of his working life when I first met him, but he was still a great stipendiary steward in that he could project his mind forward to changing trends and all that sort of thing in the conduct of racing inquiries and, the need for fairness and natural justice.
John talked about the elite jockeys during his time in Melbourne. He rates Roy Higgins as the best of them all.
In all the years that he rode racehorses, John, he was never, not once was he questioned about a ride on a horse.
John recalled his appointment as chief stipe in Sydney and the number of protests he upheld in his first few weeks.
Whilst the horse first past the post, has got a bit of a start because he did get there first.
Yeah.
But if he's gotten there by impeding another runner, well then, you've got to give the other bloke a bit of a crack, haven't you?
Of all the difficult situations you faced as chief steward, I'm pretty sure the one that weighed most heavily on John Schreck was the famous lignocaine case. When
Yes.
Terse, winner of the 1991 Golden Slipper, returned a positive swab. Trainer Clary Connors claimed that it was in a mouthwash that he'd used many, many times before, and you knew in your heart Clary Connors was being honest and forthright in his claims.
Well, in that case, John, that what you just said then was the very first decision that we had to make. We had to ask ourselves, do we think that Mr. Connors is telling us the truth? Mr. Connors and his father and his son, in relation to having used this particular mouthwash many times before, as you had said, and there had been a change of analytical techniques in the lead up to that year's Golden Slipper Stakes. Had it been the previous year, Terce would have returned a negative test. And we also, so we had to, the first thing we had to decide whether was Mr. Connors telling us the truth. We thought yes, he was, and his people. And the next thing we had to decide, of course, was whether or not there'd been proper care being taken of the horse in the lead up to the race. And the answer to that, yes, there was. Like, they had people with guns and all sorts of things around Terce at the time. Like, the wind could hardly get in the box, you know. And then we, of course, we had to consider the ramifications of disqualifying the horse, as well as the ramifications of not disqualifying the horse. And on balance, we just thought that it would have been manifestly over the top in all the circumstances to take the race away from Terce that year. There were some subsequent cases where the courts found along similar lines, because the words they used was in. Sometimes as you go through life, there are unique circumstances which require unique decisions. And in those days, of course, there was the discretion to allow the horse to keep the race. That discretion no longer applies, which I vehemently oppose, John. I don't. I think any stipendiary steward, each case should be judged on its own particular set of facts. And from time to time, you're going to do something a bit different. And when you do it, you live with the consequences. But they don't have that opportunity to do that now, and I don't agree with that. You'll have a horse one day that'll return a positive to something, a little thing, could be an interdominion you'll have, John, and you won't have any, you mightn't even be wasting your time to even go to the room, because the horse will be mandatorily disqualified. And I don't think that's right. I think you should have the opportunity of at least putting a case. And of course horses that return positive tests, John, should be disqualified. They should be. But now and again, there's the odd
extenuating circumstance,
John. Yeah, it might happen once in a lifetime, but when it comes along, you should stand up and be counted. You know.
Yeah. Well, Clary Connors was fined, I think, $10,000.
Yes.
Terce retained the Golden Slipper.
Yes.
But easily the most vocal, high-profile detractor regarding your decision was the late Colin Hayes, who just happened to train the runner-up.
Yes.
A horse called Canonise.
That's right.
He didn't miss you, did he?
No, he didn't. No, Mr. CS was, again, he was a very good supporter of mine over the years, really, really good. You know, he was a very decent, genuine guy, and we got along very well, CS. And but he let fly over that, of course. It was owned by Robert Sangster, of course, Canonise. And, but I suppose, John, put yourself in his position, you'd probably do the same thing and say the same things, because it would have made a big difference to the stud value of Canonise, and a big difference to, I suppose, Robert Sangster in those days didn't. The money probably wasn't such a big thing, but it was. But anyway, rightly or wrongly, John, I still think that in that particular case, we had the right decision was made.
1995 brought the infamous jockey tape scandal, which resulted in 3 high-profile Sydney jockeys being disqualified for bringing racing into disrepute.
Yes.
Their voices had been recognised on a phone tap audio tape, talking to a man who became known in all of this affair as Mr. C.
Yes. It was a bad thing for the sport, John, and I don't know. It'll be one of these days we might find out what happened, why it was leaked on the Thursday before the Golden Slipper Stakes. Obviously, whoever leaked it to Kate McClimate, she was the journalist at the Herald at the time, and she's the one that's done a lot of work on the McGurk case in the Herald. She's a very clever investigative journalist, and it hit the papers on the Friday morning before the Golden Slipper Stakes. So it was obviously leaked to her for the major impact.
On the eve of
on the
one
eve
of our
of,
great race days.
Exactly, John. And it was sad for the sport and sad for the people involved. But when you look back at it, John, I know it was bad and the whole thing was bad, but it was blown out of all proportions.
The most overblown, sensational story in racing history.
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that. And, you know, if Kevin Moses was sitting here, he'd say, hurrah, hurrah. He'd agree with you 1,000,000% because he did 12 months out of it. And, you know, wasn't very happy, of course. But all the jocks were... I heard the tapes, of course, John, and didn't use the tapes against the riders because it would have been unfair to do so. And I didn't hear the tapes in that form anyway. But I knew back in the spring of '94 that these tapes were about, and kept asking certain people, is everything all right? And I was assured that it was. There was nothing. But once they got into the press, of course, that became... Then it wasn't all right. It was a blue, and we had to do what we had to do.
Fine Cotton won't give in. Harbour goal, Fine Cotton's going to hold on, I think. Oh, he's just in front. Oh, he may have won by a nose. There's nothing in it.
John, the Fine Cotton ring-in scandal of 1984 has long passed into racing folklore.
Yes.
In fact, we heard only a short time ago that dear old Fine Cotton himself had passed on. 8 people in this state were warned off. 1 appeal was upheld. Now, a man called Ian Murray was charged. He pleaded guilty. He was warned off. But the AJC forgot to tell him to stay around until the case was put to rest. He disappeared. Guess who got the job of finding him and bringing him back again?
Yes, well, it's John. Whilst you've raised that, if I could just raise one matter, Mr. Waterhouse, of course, has written a book of recent times where he's gone into print, and I'm sure he's only gone into print this way because he doesn't know the facts. But a lot of people think that was taken out of the hands of the stewards by the AJC. That was 100%, 1,000,000% not right. It was. I went to the AJC committee and begged them to handle it the way that it was ultimately done, because it was too big a deal for us to handle as a normal stipendiary stewards panel. We couldn't have done it, John. And with all the hearsay that was about and all that sort of thing, the case would have been voided. We wouldn't have got anywhere with it. And so it was handled. We became the investigators and created a brief which was put to the AJC committee, and they ultimately decided to do what they did. And that was why it was handled that way. Briefly, that was why it was handled that way. But in relation to Mr. Murray, what you say is pretty right. He was warned off by the committee, and the committee gave written reasons for doing what they did. And everybody else that was warned off went to an appeal before the Racing Appeals Tribunal, before Judge Gorin. But Mr. Murray said that he wasn't going to appeal because the written reasons produced by the AJC were in accordance with the facts. And so it would be just wasting everybody's time for him to appeal. So the AJC committee, and I don't know how they let it happen, they said, thanks very much, and, you know, we'll see you when your time's up. And he then promptly... Ian Murray was a great... he used to go on safaris in Africa shooting and down the Amazon fishing and all this sort of thing. So after he was given the all clear by the AJC committee, he promptly went to the Lakes District of Tasmania trout fishing. And Mr. Bell, who was the chairman of the AJC committee, came to me one day at Randwick and said, we want you to go and find Ian Bell. I said, that's terrific, where is he? Thinking I'd just get a taxi cab. And he said he's in Tasmania somewhere trout fishing. So I said, look, boss, that's not quite as easy as it sounds. And he said, well, I don't care. You get on a plane now and go down there and get him. So I went home and packed a bag and got on a plane and went to Tasmania. And there was a chap, Brown, whose daughter was one of the girls in the dreadful cycle crash in Germany years later. He was the chief stipe down there at the time. So he picked me up at Launceston, and he was Michael Schumacher II, this guy. He would drive like the clappers. And we drove down to Bothwell, started our search there, and saw a fellow who Ian Murray used to go fishing with, and this fellow's wife, and she said, oh, they're up in the mountains on the lakes fishing. So away we go again up to the... And I don't know, John, sometimes, you know, you're a racehorse trainer, sometimes 100 to 1 shot gets up when you don't expect it. This was 1,000,000 to 1 shot, and we were driving crazily around, and it was getting late in the afternoon. And we went over the brow of a hill, and down on the edge of the lake was this camp with Mr. Murray and his son and another guy, an old mate of his from Bothwell, and we just stumbled across them. And he and I went over. It was freezing bloody cold, John, and we had a great big scotch and went over and by ourselves and talked about him coming back, and he said, yeah, well, that's probably the right thing to do. I better go back and say what actually happened. So he did come back and appeared before the courts again, which must have been extraordinarily difficult for him, John, because, I mean, he was pulverised by opposing barristers and all that sort of thing. But, he said he'd come back. Excuse me.
He went quietly.
He said he'd come back, and we met at the Hobart airport the next morning, and we flew back together, and he was in the witness box that afternoon.
Not only do you support the new whip rules in Australian racing, but I think you were quoted once as saying that you are ashamed of the fact that you didn't do more yourself during your time as a steward to restrict the use of the whip.
Yeah, that's right, John. I did say that, and I mean it. Over the years I worked as a racing steward, I made a lot of mistakes, a lot of big mistakes. Some not, I don't think anyone ever got put out that shouldn't have got put out, but many didn't get put out that should have got put out because of mistakes that I made, decisions I made which were wrong. But with the whip, John, you see, lots of things, when I was working as a racing steward, particularly in Sydney, it's such a tough sort of town. In those days, it was, there was millions and millions of dollars being bet, John, It was big, big money. Some of it black being turned into white. I know all that, and so do you. But a lot of people who should have known better, and I should have known better too, but a lot of people, unless they were under the whip, John, they were dead. And I fell into that, It was crazy, I know, and I shouldn't have done, but I did. So I used to think, well, unless they pull the whip on them, they're kind of not doing enough, But that was really a very bad philosophy, and I should have done more to try and curtail the whip use, and it wouldn't have been the drama that it is now.
So you're very comfortable with the reforms?
Very comfortable with the reforms, John, and it can't do anything but good. The jocks, I'm disappointed with that the jockeys have not fallen into line better and quicker than they have. If they go to ride in England or Hong Kong or America or these places, they fall into line just like that. Otherwise they get put out, John. So why can't they fall into line here? I just don't. I can't get it through my head that they can't grasp the new rules better and quicker than they have done. I'm sure they will eventually.
Well, John, after 14 and a half years in the job here in Sydney, you felt the need for a complete change of direction. You took up a 3-year contract to go to Singapore as a professional steward. Now, what does that mean?
It was a very unique position, John. I was kind of above the racing stewards, of the stipendiary stewards, working with the committee of the Singapore Turf Club and the committees of the 3 tracks in Malaysia, hearing appeals and reviewing rules and all that kind of thing. It was truly, truly the best job that I've ever had in my whole life. The money was good. At that time, the Singapore dollar was about 1 for 1 with the Australian dollar. If I'd get on a plane to go to Penang or anywhere, it'd be, with Singapore Airlines, and I'd have either 1A or 1B, like I'd be right up the front, be first class travel, staying at 5-star hotels. But I completely and utterly stuffed it up, John. I went from working with the AJC, where whatever I wanted, pretty much I got, If I wanted a rule change, I got. And to working for the Singapore Turf Club, who are a sort of semi-statutory authority, a government body. And I didn't... later on I got better at it, but when I first went to Asia, as lots and lots of Australians have done, John, I didn't handle the Asian scene well at all. I just really didn't handle it well at all. I didn't understand the face thing, and I didn't do the job. I did the job all right, but I didn't handle the politics of it at all well. So after 1 year of the 3-year contract, I resigned and moved on. which I'd like to go back and start there again. Might still be there, John, because it was a really good job, you know, and a wonderful place to live, of course. And racing's going pretty well there at the moment, actually.
You moved on to Mauritius as a steward and a racing consultant. Now, you've often described Mauritius as and this is a big claim, the most exciting race place in the world.
I don't think there's any doubt about that, John. It's the second oldest racetrack in the world behind race club in the world behind the Jockey Club out of England, and the track's only 7 furlongs around it, and it's right in the middle of town. When the races are on, they've got to close a number of streets so people can get to and from the track and all this sort of thing. And I had the one season there, and when I was there, you know, they used to shut the gate. The gates, there were so many people want to go. They used to have, it's a very strong soccer place, and they used to have the club soccer on the Saturdays, competing with the football.
Yeah.
But eventually they stopped that. They had to play the soccer on the Sunday because they just weren't getting anybody at the soccer, like nobody at all. I mean, truly nobody. That's how strong the horse racing is there. When I was, the year I had there was, I think there used to be 85 bookmakers. And they'd do the declarations for Saturday racing on lunch at noontime, say on Thursday, and then on Thursday afternoon, these 85 bookies had set up over in the centre of the track, and I promise you there'd be more people there of a Thursday afternoon than there would have been at Canterbury of a Wednesday.
Yeah.
Like there'd be 7,000 or 8,000 people get there wanting to have a bit of a. It's different now because they've got off-track tote things and all this sort of stuff, but the horses weren't. Great horses, most of them from South Africa.
Yeah.
But I don't think it matters, John, whether the horses are good, bad or indifferent, so long as they're fairly evenly graded. And that was the case in Mauritius. And it's a little tight mounting yard, and they let you know if they're not happy.
You spent 2 years as director of racing in Macau. No stewarding this time, purely administrative.
Yeah, and I wasn't much good at it, John, to be truthful with you. You know, once a copper, always a copper, kind of thing. And it was hard for me to give it away. Ian Patterson came up there as the chief steward with me, and we ran the Asian Racing Conference, which was good. And in those days, Macau was going pretty good. There was about 1,200 or 1,300 horses there. John Didham was one of the leading jockeys there. It was Gordon Benson was one of the leading trainers there. It was going along pretty good, really good actually. The Asian Racing Conference was held there, and there was about 500 or 600 delegates from all around the world went there. And it was a great experience. But I'm not really a great administrator, John. I can't. Ian Patterson used to have to help me a lot with budgets, and because we'd spend billions of Hong Kong dollars on, because all the horses there are fed by the club, and the owners don't pay. They're all billed by the club, this kind of thing, same as in Hong Kong. But the only thing about it is that we were there at a time when the Macau as a town was kind of still a bit Wild Westish. It's all changed now, of course. It's a bigger gambling place than Las Vegas these days. But it was an interesting place. We're going back there for Christmas.
Then came possibly the most rewarding 3 years of your career. Chief steward for the Hong Kong Jockey Club. It must be difficult not to get caught up in the hype created by those huge crowds of screaming fans.
Yeah, well, it is, John. And again, it's a bit like Mauritius in that, if I walked onto the track of a morning, there'd be 8 or 10 different photographers just clipping away. It's wonderful for the ego, but it does the attention that the sport attracts, because there's about 12 or 14% of the gross income that the government derives comes from the Jockey Club. So it's a fairly important organisation in the town, in the region. But again, John, I was lucky when I went there. There was a fellow called Lee was the chairman. Then later on, Mr. Ronald R. Cully was the chairman. He had a lot of good horses here. He won Kingston. He raced, I can't think of their names, but he had a lot of good horses here with John Marr when he was training in Melbourne. And then later on, a fellow called John Chan was chairman. They were all really good to me. And I worked with a chap called Engelbert Breskus, a German guy, and we had our disagreements. But he was a real true blue race fan, John. You know, he loved the sport, and he'd go on holidays and go to the races kind of thing. It's such an exciting place to live, John, you know. Mm-hmm. Tax is low and money's good, and, you know, I was able to build my superannuation up, and you always got money in your pocket, you know. Mm. And if you... it was
a fruitful 3 years.
Very fruitful 3 years, and I saw some wonderful jockeys, you know, Fallon and Soumillon and Pellier and all those great Northern Hemisphere jocks there. And so it was, and, you know, and I had the best seat in the house, John.
Yeah.
You know, and I was dealing with all those blokes day after day. So it was very good. And there'd been an Australian as a chief stipe there years and years, I think before the war. But there hadn't been anybody from Australia as chief steward there until I went there. But then after I left, Jamie Steer took over, and now Kim Kelly. So we've kind of, hopefully, cemented a place back there, you know, as in racing control, I mean. Australians, that is. So it was good, John, yeah.
Are you reasonably satisfied with all of the tough decisions you've made over a long period of years, or are there still one or two that wake you up in the middle of the night?
John, as I mentioned to you earlier, there are always things that you can do differently and better. And as a racing steward, I had the philosophy that I'd like to make decisions quickly. I didn't like adjourning inquiries and that kind of thing, because I didn't think that, unless you really were worried about something, it wasn't fair to the participants. They were entitled to know what was going on quickly so they could get on with their lives. But looking back, there are times. I don't think, John, I truly don't think that there were decisions that I took that penalised people when they ought not to have been penalised. Yeah. But obviously there are times that I should have done things differently. There were some people that, you know, I should have not hastened quite so quickly and gone about things a bit differently. And I'm sure would have come up with a different decision at the end of the day. But you see, John, having said that, though, what people should understand, you know, judges of the court send people to jail and deprive them of their liberty. You know, they can't walk the streets and that sort of thing. The next most powerful penalty that can be imposed, I think, is to deprive someone of their right to work. So you can go to Bankstown next week and someone like me can say, all right, Mr. Tapp, you're out for 12 months for some reason or other, and then your right to work with your horses is gone. It's an enormous power, John, for someone such as myself to carry around. And that's why the people that are becoming stipendiary stewards today are different from me. They're better educated. They mightn't probably have the you know, my schooling was very minimal, John, but my education carries on to now, today. Yeah. I'm still learning. So I would hope that I've always made a point of treating people properly and fairly, with dignity, and respected the power that I had. And John, I hope the people that are doing the sort of work that I did over the years today have the same sort of philosophy and take very much into account the power that they've got and exercise that power carefully and with the proper care to those before them and the impact that those decisions could have.